What are the conditions that enable humans to face what is scary and overwhelming and threatening? And what are the conditions that enable and cultivate our capacity to want to repair, to want to mend, to want to do something, to want to help? That is it. How do we
Okay.
look at what's hard, and how do we, create the conditions that foster repair, that foster what's called reparation, reparative instinct that we have? And so if you really, unpick that, then it becomes a much more richer, a more dynamic, a more nuanced set of interventions and practices and skill building
Okay.
that we can all be engaging with.
Renée Lertzman, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you on this? It's the full moon, actually, on this day of the full moon in May.
Exactly, full moon in Scorpio.
Yes.
I am well. I'm very, very excited to be here with you.
Okay.
And I'm happen to be physically in Portland, Oregon at this moment.
Nice.
Normally my home is in California, but right now I'm in Portland.
Sounds gorgeous and beautiful. Trees outside your windows. So,
Mhm,
yeah,
mhm.
it's one of those places I always wanted to visit. And the world being what it is at the moment, that's probably not going to be a clever thing. I don't think I'd get past the airport. Anyway, you I listened to your TED Talk just before we came on, and I've been exploring your websites, and you seem to me to be one of those people who is right at that liminal space between the psychology of the meta-crisis, the existential chaos of our times, and the behavioral change that we're all going to have to make if our species is going to make it through, frankly. And you're also one of the people who's been saying this for quite a long time.
Mhm,
So can you unpick for us in whatever way works for you
mhm.
that liminal space and how we can expand it to encompass the whole world?
Sure. Thank you.
Fix everything for me in 5 minutes, Renee. That'd
Uh,
be great.
I'm gonna do so, the work for me goes back to the late 1980s when I was a young person, and I was primarily focused on psychology and specifically psychotherapy. I had been already influenced and impacted by my experience with psychotherapists from a teenager, living in a family with addiction and trauma and so forth. So I was convinced I'm going to be a psychologist. And then once I found myself at university and, started learning and specifically ended up in a environmental science and studies, kind of one of these 101 courses, my whole world changed. And so for me, these realms of psychological human sciences and environment and climate crisis, existential crisis are utterly interconnected or integrated. I can't even imagine seeing these as separate domains because we are human beings who have generated and participated in creating variety of existential threats and impacts to humans and non-human life and the whole planetary biosphere. It seems to make sense to me that those who are working on behalf of existential threat, planetary crisis, and so forth would want to be opportunistic and really understand at the deepest possible level. One, how did we get here, right? And two, what do we do about it? And it turns out that, psychology has a lot to offer us. Uh, so that's where I'm at the intersection. And so, yes, for decades now, I've been sort of stitching these worlds together, often on my own, kind of bridging, whether that means partnering with people who have clinical training and bringing them into rooms and spaces with people who are focused more on environmental policy or climate, action, and so, or the other way around. So it's a sort of, but that's been going on for a number of years. But fast forward to now, and it's a really burgeoning, dynamic, incredible field that right now.
Okay, let's get to that in a minute. Let's just take a step back to you're training to be a psychologist and a psychotherapist. Unpick that for me. And you went to a 101. What was it about what you heard there that shifted the trajectory that you were on?
So I was focused on training to be a psychotherapist, and I was a psychology major and taking a variety of courses in psychology, social psychology, cognitive psychology, personality psychology, that whole realm.
Okay.
And then I found myself in this course where every week we were having lectures about different aspects of environmental degradation, and pretty profound, very profound impacts that humans had on our planet.
And this was in the 80s. So that was nothing compared to what it is now.
Yeah, 87, 88. And so we were learning about deforestation. We were learning about, toxins. We were learning about Rachel Carson. We were learning about species loss. We were learning about biodiversity, and just beginning to hear more about climate change and global warming. So that because literally it was the late 1980s that this was starting to kind of break through.
Yeah, Jim Hansen was just beginning to do his work and going to speak at Congress. And
Right. So with a thread throughout the course, it certainly wasn't centered on climate change. So what happened for me as a young person, who already, I think, had a predisposition to wanting to make the world better, or, caring for the world, caring for especially nature. I was so deeply troubled by what I was learning about. And I was both troubled by what I was learning about, and I was equally troubled by the lack of acknowledgement and support for the experience of learning about these issues. So I would come out of the class kind of in a daze. I would come out feeling so destabilized, like, well, nothing really mattered. Like, it just struck me as very surreal and bizarre that people were just kind of going along, acting as if nothing was happening, when we were going into this kind of space, just like conference now. Like, we have these events and gatherings where people come together and look directly at what's happening with the planet and with degradation and with like all these crises unfolding, meta crises unfolding. And meanwhile, it feels like the rest of the world is sort of continuing
business as usual.
Right? Like, and so I was perplexed by why there wasn't more, acknowledgement of what does it mean, especially as a young person, 19, 20 years old. What does it mean to come to terms with our world, right now? And so, like a lot of young people are today, for me back then, I went through a similar experience where I just felt like I have to rethink everything.
Right.
And so I actually dropped out of school.
You did?
I did. I petitioned to get a professor to sponsor me to do my own independent study where I bridged environmental studies and psychology. And I was told, I wasn't able to find that support or sponsorship.
Darn.
Yeah.
It's so obvious now that should be a thing.
It was before its time, I guess.
Right.
And then I went on a field study course where I was backpacking with a small group of people. And I mentioned this in the TED Talk.
You did, yeah.
Where we were out in real wilderness, like everywhere we went, involved hiking many miles into the backcountry, and really reading and writing and reflecting on the state of the world. And that experience was really the turning point where I kind of started connecting some dots between the experience of being in a smaller group, like a little tribe or a cohort, where your experience was validated and normalized, and
Right.
two, just having that space to do some sense making. But I think probably the most impactful of that experience, even though yes, it was nature immersion and that was profound, was having my experience be validated,
Hmm.
right? Which is, oh, you're not crazy.
And you're not
Actually,
on your own.
yeah,
Yeah.
you're not on your own, and you are onto something. And it was that teacher I had, that instructor who, had the capacity to say, I see you and you're onto something. And that's all we need
Right.
often, is a little bit of
Yes.
like a little crumb to keep going.
Yes. Yes. Sarah Schlotter says that being seen, feeling, felt, and getting gotten. That sense of somebody going, yes, I hear
Exactly.
you, and that's yes.
That's right.
So
Mhm.
then, did you drop back in again, having dropped
So
out?
then I migrated back in. I
Right.
ended, traversing back in a different entry point, which was a program where I could do exactly what I wanted and create
Right.
my own kind of interdisciplinary study. And yeah, I mean, and then from that point on, this has always been my focus. My
Right.
undergraduate, my master's, my PhD research has always been on applying clinical psychology, and specifically a trauma-informed approach, which again, back then wasn't talked about as much as it is now. I wrote and gave my first conference paper in 1993 called Ecological Trauma,
Wow.
and it was roundly rejected, except for, again, a couple of key people who were like, "You're onto something, keep going." But most people were like, "We don't get this, like, why are you describing this as trauma? That feels really."
In 93.
Yeah,
God.
1993.
Wow. I suppose everybody was busy declaring war in the Gulf and things in those days, weren't they? It was,
Mhm, mhm. Yeah.
and now it seems obvious.
Mhm.
So I'm going from that, where people looking at you like you've grown horns in 93 to 2025. This feels to me like this is a whole subcategory all on its own now. You're not alone, but you were the trailblazer. What are you seeing has changed
Mhm.
in the various professions that you touch on? Because you're touching on cognitive neuroscience, you're touching on therapy, and particularly trauma-informed therapy. You're touching on the whole of the climate aware space, but also the meta crisis aware, that this is about equity and governance and politics and sense making and AI and technology and all of the things. It's not just about the amount of CO2 we chuck out. In all of those, how are you seeing the response that you get shifting?
Well, I'm seeing the influence in recent years on trauma-informed work. So I often think about individuals who have helped to sort of break through what
Hmm.
had been a more specialized and esoteric field. There's individuals like, Bessel van der Kolk, or,
Right.
there's so many.
Gabor
uh,
Mate and yeah,
and
Peter Levine. Yes.
Peter
Okay.
Levine, exactly, who, there's women as well, but these individuals have done a lot to really get in the mainstream. I have a practice. I take photos of airport bookstores whenever I'm traveling, and it's kind of amazing that Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk's books are consistently on the nonfiction table, in airport
Right.
around the world. So all that to say that what that's enabled is a language and a vernacular and a way of describing and talking about the felt experience of living in existential crisis and polycrisis. Um, so that's one, which is, that I'm noticing is a real acceleration of that. Um, I think that it might be helpful to describe what I've observed of the evolution of the field. I
Please
think
do.
a lot of
Yes.
people know about this, and I'm very excited to say I just got a book deal, and
Yes.
my book
We
is
need
going to
to
be
talk about
going
it.
into this. Yes.
Yes. And your
So,
book is called
well, the
Book Now?
working title is The Changemaker Code.
Oh, cool.
But I have a feeling that will shift. But right now it's the Changemaker Code, a user's guide to, making the
Oh.
world kind of thing.
Who's your publisher? Can you tell us
Like
that?
Viking,
Oh,
Penguin.
cool. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, and if they've gone for that, well, marketing, yeah, yes, I used to be a Penguin Random House. Marketing does have a tendency to come in right at the end and go, no, that title won't work.
Yeah.
Why not?
Right.
But the Changemaker code feels good to me. All right, and
Yeah.
any idea of a publication date, roughly?
It'll be, I'm hoping for early 2027 or
Okay.
late
You
2026.
can come back when it's ready to go, and we'll talk about it more. But
Great. Great.
congratulations, and
Thank you.
yes, do tell us about the
And
evolution.
so I'm going to share in 5 minutes the
The-
history of the the psychology of
Good.
existential threat and climate change.
Okay.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
So, and I have this visual that I use. It's on my website. People can check it out.
If you send it to us, we'll put it on the show notes.
It's these, I call them quadrants. And I created this. I'll just tell a story. So after leaving academia, I was very much of an academic, had a postdoc fellowship here in Portland, Oregon in 2010, 2011, after finishing my PhD from Cardiff University. And yes. And I left academia and almost very soon after was commissioned by some incredible individuals with the Skoll Global Threats Fund, which was a think tank offshoot of the Skoll Foundation, Skoll, Skoll. And what they wanted was a literature review of the psychology of climate change, of climate engagement. And I started, diving into this and looking at the research and looking at the field. And very early on in that process, some things started coming together for me. One was that there are almost like these factions within the field, that aren't necessarily being talked about, but are very much there. So in the 1980s, here we go. In the 1980s, the first journal publication linking psychology with global warming was published in the 86, 87 by Baruch Fischoff, a professor who really focused on risk psychology and decision making. That kind of really looking at how do people make decisions, how do people evaluate risk. So what happened in the late 1980s was the psychology of climate change was primarily framed and looked at as a decision-making and risk psychology issue. So that was Paul Slovic. Then it became a variety of individuals who all, were working very closely together. But the orientation was a cognitive behavioral approach that, was really looking at affect was part of it, emotion was part of it, but not a big part of it. It was more like how do people weigh things up? And so the field was very influenced by behavioral economics and behavioral science, which is a very particular lens. And that lens is really asking the question, how do we, really get people to do what we want, need humans to do? So that's kind of classic behavior change. And then from there, we see nudge theory and we see, incentivizing, and we see penalties and fees and all of these things that come out of behavioral psychology. Then in the 1990s, we started to see, I'm moving up the quadrant, we started to see more attention and recognition of language and messaging and framing. And so that became really a huge focus. And so we saw work like Anthony Lazarowitz, who runs the Yale Center on Climate Communication, come up with the Six Americas. We started to see more people like George Lakoff, who really study language and framing from a policy perspective, right? Like he has the book Don't Think About the Elephant, and that started to really influence the field. And so then the problem definition was, what is the right message in the way we talk about this that will shift people's engagement and get people to care? And then we move from the messaging and framing and storytelling kind of fixation into, in the 2000s, the design thinking and innovation sector really started really interfacing with climate, environment, And then the question was really, how do we approach this as a design problem and applying design thinking? So then we started to see, organizations like Ashoka and IDEO.org. And a lot of this coming out of, not surprisingly, the innovation sector and Silicon Valley, framing climate as something to solve.
Yeah, solve for
You ought-
climate. That's what
right?
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Like the whole John Doerr, like the speed and scale and acceleration and climate tech and accelerators, incubators, hackathons, climate hackathons, prizes, the X Prize, all of that comes out of that space because in actuality, that can really spark innovation in an incredible way. So each of these has a piece of the puzzle, right? Each of these is like an unlock in specific ways, but they all have very distinct theories of change. And they have very distinct ways of understanding humans. And then finally, the fourth quadrant is the more emotional, experiential, trauma-informed interventions. And from that, we see this incredible rise of things like climate cafes, climate circles, art-based interventions. Dear Tomorrow just was written up, I think, in the Washington Post, where you have people write letters to the future. Very experiential ways of engaging with these issues. And so that quadrant is really the most recent that I've been most, you know, affiliated with and associated with, is how do we bring that into the picture? And now what we're seeing is a progression of integrating across these factions and theories of change, although I do still think there's a lot of siloing happening, and I still see a lot of well-funded and well-resourced climate initiatives and work be largely colonized by particular ways of thinking that are, in fact, I believe, mechanistic and rooted in a dualistic approach, which is as if we can separate the head from the heart, as if we can, quote, make people, try to, quote, get people to do something. Whereas, we need to kind of get up to speed with where the neuroscience and where trauma-informed research is, which is, in fact, that, it's much less of an issue of getting people to care, making people change. It's actually about connection, belonging, meaning, mattering, purpose, impact, people, working with people's experience of helplessness and impotency, and not just, uh, attacking that with a lot of cheerleading, educating, and yelling, basically.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was
So
a lot.
before that was really interesting. I didn't get most of the names. We're going to have to go through at the end and get them into the transcript, but we'll worry about that after. Because it seems to me that other than the fourth quadrant you just described, these are all fundamentally people working on the knowledge deficit model, which is if everybody knew what I knew, everybody would care. And here are the ways to make everybody care like I care. As if being anxious was an end point in itself. Because I was not aware of, and I perhaps not been looking in the right places, but nobody was offering, and here are the steps that we take to create a different reality and a different way of being, and not just minor tweaks in behavior like recycling and driving different kinds of cars, but total systemic change and total behavioral change. And when I talk to very well-meaning people in the design space or the business space, that's the point where they look at me as if I've started talking a different language. And it doesn't land because I don't have the language to say just getting people to be aware is not actually an answer.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, within the cognitive neuroscience and the trauma-informed space, what are the theories of change that aren't simply theories of getting people to agree with us so that we're all on the same page about how bad it is?
Exactly. Right. Um, well, first, I just want to acknowledge that this perpetual, it feels like a very circular quandary of how do we get people to care? How do we make people aware and understand? That's grounded in a knowledge deficit model, or what I talk about in my first book, Environmental Melancholia. I talk about this as this kind of, notion that there's a gap, right, between what we know and what we do, the knowing doing gap, and we have to like bridge this gap. And if we actually take a few minutes, if you take a few moments to slow down and think about it, it's less of a gap, right? It's much more of a tangle. It's where people get tangled up. And so, coming out of so one, I would like us to put to rest this. It's just like such a waste of time and energy to keep asking again, what will motivate people to care? What will get people to care? How do we motivate people? That to me is an absolutely unproductive line of questioning and takes up a huge amount of resource that we don't have right now. So let's just catch up with where the science is, and let's be science-based about our approach to climate action. Let's like actually be science-based. If we keep going around saying other people should be science-based, we should be science-based as well, which means that we really look at, the science of human behavior. And one of the key, elements of that, if we look at neuroscience, number one is when human, experience affect, AFFECT, that involves fear,
There's basically when they experience a feeling.
feeling. Yes,
Affect is
not
the
necessarily an
sign.
emotion. It's not the same as
Yes,
an emotion because it's not necessarily even at a like cognitive level. It's like in
right,
your
right.
system. If you
Deep,
feel
deep down in your hindbrain somewhere.
exactly
Yes.
fear, anxiety, guilt, disgust, shame, those kinds of affects are well established to influence the way that we cognitively process information. And,
Right.
this is very well established, right? Like I have a mountain of research, and I love to pull out quotes periodically because it's sort of like if the climate space took any of this on board, it would absolutely change the way we go about what we do. Period.
Right.
Like, if you actually accept that these affects impair and impede our cognitive process, that ideally invokes a pause of, okay,
So
let's
hang on, they impair and
thoughtful about
impede our
this.
cognitive process. So let's just unpick that bit. So if we're feeling any of the things that you just outlined, our capacity to think clearly downgrades.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Right.
And
I
and
just
not,
think that's worth highlighting.
it is. And not in the same ways for everyone, right? But this isn't a very well established fact. So that begs the question, what are the conditions? To me, this is the only question we should be asking right now.
Okay.
Literally. It's like what's guided everything I do. If that's the case, which it is, what are the conditions that enable humans to face what is scary and overwhelming and threatening? And what are the conditions that enable and cultivate our capacity to want to repair, to want to mend, to want to do something, to want to help? That is it. How do we
Okay.
look at what's hard, and how do we, create the conditions that foster repair, that foster what's called reparation, reparative instinct that we have? And so if you really like unpick that, then it becomes a much more richer and more dynamic, a more nuanced set of interventions and practices and skill building
Okay.
that we can all be engaging with, right? And, and so again, all I'm doing is going to what we know from trauma-informed work. That's all I'm doing. I am literally, I say very openly that I'm appropriating. I don't think that's in a bad
Well,
way.
that's what science does, is we learn from
Yeah,
other
exactly.
science and we bring it together. So that's
Exactly.
cool.
So
Okay.
I aspire to give attribution whenever I possibly can. As a human being, it's not always possible, like, you don't always track, but I think attribution is really important right now. To just acknowledge, like, oh, here's the lineage, here's the source that I'm referencing.
Yeah.
So, all I'm doing, again, I'm looking to, well, what do researchers and people who actually work with other human beings, what have they found? And then I like to pull that in and see, how do we rework that? Like I'm going to be doing in London next week, literally. I'm going to be working with a leadership team in London who are doing really high impact work in the climate finance space. How do we take this work and make it into tools that they can actually apply so that they can be more effective at their ninja level, extremely high impact work they're doing? Like, that's all I'm doing. It's like a translation that a lot of us can be doing.
Okay,
I
so
don't want to be the only
give us the
one.
tools, Renee. This sounds
So,
really, important. This is it.
yes, this is it. So after many years of experimentation, working with amazing people, gifted people, we have these 5 guiding principles that are a bit of a distillation and kind of a simplification, but sometimes that's helpful. So first is, and just high level. First is the recognition of containers. What are containers? And that humans need containers to feel safe enough to look at what's hard. Okay.
Are we
So
going to unpick these as we go along, or do you want to go through tell us all 5 and then go back and unpick them?
I'll go
Because we will
through
need to
all
unpick.
5, but I wanted to share the container pieces almost like at the highest level.
Okay.
Is like, if we can get that piece dialed in, that's a lot.
So I don't even know what a container is. What does that mean?
That's great. So a container is a term that tends to be used in the trauma-informed world and in the clinical world. That speaks to the relational field that a human is in, that cultivates and fosters a sense of being held. Like there's a container, there's a boundary here. So an example would be, when I'm working with a team, an organization, I'm very attentive to the container, meaning that how do we set things up? How do we establish the kind of rules of engagement?
Right.
How do we create the conditions so that people feel seen and heard and respected and safe?
Right.
You won't be attacked here. You're not alone. It's really about that, in any conference, any gathering, any meeting, it is a form of a container. And this is why, I've said in a number of places and ways that the role of conveners and curators right now has never been more important, because folks who are convening are in fact
setting the container. Yes.
Setting the container.
So it's a set of social agreements that allow everyone to feel as safe as possible within that space.
Yes. And it can be a relational container. So an example I've been seeing recently, responses to the new Attenborough film on oceans. And on social media, people are basically sharing their emotional responses. And a lot of people are saying, I wanted to be inspired by this, but I left feeling really scared.
Right.
So this goes to the heart of, what does it mean to create the conditions and the containers that allow humans to process and metabolize information that could feel and evoke very difficult feelings and responses? Because if we don't attend to that, people generally tend to kind of shut down.
Yeah.
We shut down, we disconnect, we push it away. And so an example of creating a container would be, if you are producing a film like that, you better make sure that people feel supported in some way. And so this is an area of real innovation, where if you are producing a film like this, you could consider leading up to the launch. What if we partner with an organization that has facilitators and invites people into online forums, or like you could be very creative about it where I know, and I'm speaking for myself, I will not watch a film like that by myself.
Right.
I won't. I won't do it. And so, but if I knew that this film was partnering with a really cool organization that's like, hey, we want to support you in really like processing this, so then we can figure out what we want to do.
Exactly. And we want to bring you together with all the other people who aren't coping, but so that you can actually do something, because we don't give people direction, agency, and empowerment.
No.
What is the point in filling the knowledge deficit?
Exactly. That's exactly right. So we're really good. We're really good at stimulating and evoking feeling. We're really good at generating, anxiety or worry or concern or shock. Like, oh my God, I can't believe humans have done this. Oh my gosh, this is making me feel so sad that we've
this is the whole of
lost.
social media at the moment. Let's trigger your limbic system so that you feel constantly on edge and appalled.
Exactly. And it's irresponsible to do that if you are working on behalf of existential threat and you want to enable people to do something. It's irresponsible to go around just activating people without really following up with looking again at what these conditions are that support people to really sort of process and then want to do something. And that tends to need a container. It tends to need a relational home of some kind, which is why schools are really powerful, and nature centers, and anywhere where people are coming together. These are really powerful engines, especially if they include some acknowledgement of how people are feeling and let people kind of name their feelings and so forth. So
I have a question. I'm just thinking of things that happen locally in my community of place. And there are a certain class of people where even that language is triggering, because you're asking people to feel in public. And particularly people of a certain age, but not exclusively, are particularly, people who are not customarily exposed to trauma-informed thinking and feeling. Even inviting them to check in of how are you before we go around the meeting is labeled woke, frankly, and then instantly rejected. And so how do we go about creating containers that work in a mixed culture where even the language itself would fracture the capacity of a container to exist? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, it does. And I don't think we need to be open and explicit about, feelings. We never even need to use the word feeling or anything like that. One, I think it's important to partner with people who are coming from a different perspective and kind of co-create it together. Like, okay, let's come together and in other words, not to come in and start imposing a way of being and thinking, but really like coming from a place of recognizing that we all care about our place and where we live, basically. So an example of that is when I did my PhD research, and I was doing it at Cardiff, but my research was based in the United States and the Great Lakes region. And I was researching and interviewing people living in a community near the Great Lakes called Green Bay, Wisconsin, and having these conversations with people who ordinarily you would, from the outside, would say, well, they're conservative, they're, whatever, they don't care, because they weren't involved with anything environmental. They weren't, they didn't fill any of that criteria. And often these are the people that get written off from environmental groups. So I went and spent time with a number of these people in their homes. And the opening prompt was always, tell me about where you grew up and where you live. Like, it was literally that, like that. And then from that prompt, we get into all kinds of territory about, people showing me photos of their boat and people, telling me stories about growing up fishing and now they can't anymore. Or, can't swim. And someone who told me that, he went swimming in the river and got hepatitis, but this is someone who deeply is connected with the water and the river. And, so it's through telling stories it's not necessarily like I never once asked anyone, and I very rarely ask anyone ever, "How are you feeling?" Because I mean, that's a lie. I do actually ask people how they're feeling, but it's often in a very non-directive way. And there's just many ways of finding ourselves there. Like, tell me about, what you did, whatever. Like invoking a story. So that's how I would approach it. It's not like, okay, we're gonna all talk about our feelings now. Bring an object that is bring an object to the meeting and talk about, why it has significance for you, right? Like things like that. We get at feelings in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. All right.
Okay.
So on your list of 5, we start with container,
5
and
guiding
that's a skill in its own right. Actually, training
It
people
is.
to hold the containers sounds like a very important thing to be doing.
It is
Are you
It's
doing
a big
this?
part of what I do.
Okay.
And I think there's a lot of people in the world who are skilled at this who could be leveraged more than they are. So that's not one of the principles. That's like the overarching kind of meta concept.
Okay.
So the 5 guiding principles, it's basically the playbook for being a relational trauma-informed change maker today. And the first one is called Attune. And Attune is about recognizing the necessity to be attuned to yourself first and foremost, right?
Right.
Like connected with your own reactivity, connected with your own sense of presence, connected with your own experience, like that. Oh, everything starts from that essential
And
kind of
just being aware of what you're feeling, which is what we
exact.
just said. We weren't going to talk to other people about. You've got to have the capacity to turn your awareness into the various parts of yourselves
Yeah,
that are active at the time.
yeah. I mean, there is no effective change making in the world without some modicum of self-awareness. And I mean, I think that's just a law of nature. I mentioned that in my TED talk spontaneously. I wasn't that scripted, but I basically said, I'm sorry to have to say that there's no bypass. You can't get around it. We have to practice inner awareness, and it's a lifelong practice of tuning into ourselves. In order to be attuned to those that we are working with and for. And so there's a variety of ways of being attuned. There's listening, there's doing listening tours, there's using surveys, there's many, many ways of tuning in and really sensing what your either stakeholders, communities, audiences, followers, funders, partners, vendors, your what I call your people. Um, so being attuned to their anxieties, being attuned to their ambivalence or conflict or dilemmas or competing priorities, and being attuned to their deepest aspirations for themselves and for what they want in the world. And if we need to hold those 3 A's together. Often there's a bypass and we wanted to be cheerleaders and say, "Oh, yay, yay,
Right.
yay."
Go for your aspirations, but ignore your anxieties and your ambivalence.
If you skip over that, the anxiety and the ambivalence will get louder and louder and
Right.
louder, and it will actually undermine our deepest aspiration. That's psychology. That's how it works, right?
But we're asking then people, either the person doing this has to be incredibly good at reading the room
Mhm.
or the nation or whatever they're reading, or you're asking everybody to be self-aware and to know what their own anxieties and ambivalence are. And, I've done decades of therapy, and it can take a long time to get to I'm aware that there's something cramped up inside, but it can take a long time to bring it
Mhm.
to a point where I could
Sure.
name it.
I'm not saying that we all have to be completely and totally self-aware all the time. I'm just acknowledging that as a practice, we want to
Okay.
include being attuned to our experience. It's not
Okay.
about being having perfection. I mean, people who know me well and work with me can tell you that, you know, um, I'm not always the most regulated person. I have a lot of anxiety. I can get very kind of hijacked by my anxiety if I'm not careful.
I'm
But I
thinking that's human, Renee, that everybody's like that.
human, but I have a high bar for myself.
That too is human.
Right. So I'm certainly not wanting to suggest in any way it's about perfection or we all have to be evolved and we all have to be super enlightened. I'm just saying as a human practice, we need to at least be committed to our own inner development in some way or another, whatever that looks
Yeah.
like. And the second guiding principle is reveal. And reveal is about telling the truth, communicating, whether that's science or data, or this is what's happening, or here's a film about oceans, or here's a TV series, or here's a podcast, or here's a conversation or a class, like all the ways that we reveal what is happening and doing it compassionately. So, how to be compassionate truth tellers is that second guiding principle, reveal. The third is convene. So how do we bring people together and actually show up in our work as conveners? And this is particularly relevant for organizations who I think need to evolve as conveners. I don't care what kind of organization you are, you can be convening people, you can be bringing people together. But it also is about, as a leader, this is a leadership capability, which is to know how to convene and really, quite honestly, like facilitate. It's so I do master classes and sprints on convening 101 and facilitation 101 specific to people working in the impact space because stakes are high and emotions are high. And so I think that we can learn some basic tools that can make a meeting, a gathering, or what have you much more effective and metabolizing and integrating as opposed to, bringing people together. Let's all feel really high and great, like, and then disperse. I hear about conferences like that all the time, including one that just happened not long ago at the Eden Project, which people were like going on about. And I also heard that there was a sense of like, okay, what happens
What
now?
now?
Right. And
Right. Because there's the theories of change that I hear in these circumstances
exactly.
don't hold water. They're back to
Exactly.
knowledge deficit. Let's get everyone to think like we do. Yay, cheerleader, we're all thinking the same.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, now what?
Yeah,
And there's a
exactly.
great big gap with the okay and now what? Okay, but we've
That,
gone attune, reveal, convene.
yep.
So
And
yes,
equip. Equip is equipping people with tools and resources. So this is very much about the model of we're going to scale tools and resources. And in a way, each of these guiding principles is an intervention. They're all interventions on ways of working and being that haven't been working so well in the climate and environmental space. This particular equip principle is an intervention on the tendency of those working in the space to unintentionally hold the work very closely and say, we got this. And we're going to basically push out campaigns and try to, again, it's the same thing, like get people, we're going to try to get you engaged. We're going to get you to sign up. We're going to get you, as opposed to, this is not just about us as a team or an organization. It's about all of us. So how do we equip you with the tools? And then we are going to be here as your partner and we're going to support you, like check in, how's it going? Right. And so imagine if, um, that was the primary approach, in climate space is we're going to give people tools and resources and scale. So if there's anyone listening to this who's a funder, this is where you want to be investing your funding is equipping people and scaling tools and resources. And finally, sustain is the fifth guiding principle, which is this notion of really encouraging ourselves to go beyond the big launch, the big push, the big, like event or whatever. And really, and you see how all these work together. It's Because when people feel co-ownership, they feel connected, they feel part of something, then it is not only about you trying to keep oxygenating something. It's about we are sustaining. And so in the work I do with organizations, for example, one of the areas I work in is employee engagement. And I've worked with a number of companies where we look at the way they engage their employees, including in a very large multinational company. And in that case, an application of this and of sustain would be get members of that community to take co-ownership over it and basically say, I'm going to do this for the next year. Like I'm going to be a part of a steering committee or whatever, as opposed to some overworked staff person trying to keep something going. You know what I mean? So that gaining is like co-owning. And you see, in order for that to work, you have to give people tools and resources. You have to equip them. You have to convene them. You have to give them information and knowledge, and then you
Right.
have to attune to
You
what
tune to
they're
them, and then you have to have the container within which it all works. Okay.
exactly.
And can you tie this up for my inner cognitive neuroscience geek and anybody listening? What are the what's the cognitive neuroscience that links all this together? What's the theory of change behind the theory of change? Does that make sense? I want to understand the kind of neurophysiology that underpins this, and then I want to look at actually what theory of change is.
Right. So the neuroscience underpinnings has to do with when we feel supported and we're not alone, that we're in relationship with others,
Right.
and we feel that there is some way we can channel our feelings or energy or and so forth in a constructive way, then we will move in that direction.
Right.
When we short circuit and sort of opt out, like, what difference is it going to make anyway? I have nothing to contribute. I'm all alone. No one around me understands. That's where the majority of humans tend to get stalled out.
Right. So I
And
just watched this. Let's say I watched the Attenborough, which I haven't, but let's suppose I had. I'm on my own. I am now completely terrified that the oceans are going to become devoid of
yeah,
life within 20 years.
mhm,
And I have no idea what to do about this.
exactly.
Whereas if I had a group of people, even if it's a group of people spread across the rest of the world, to
Mhm.
connect with, to share my despair with other people who get it, and then to begin to act. We're back to building tribes again, aren't we? We're back to building communities that
Mhm.
work, communities of place
Exactly.
and purpose and passion.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it strikes me that these things will only work if we have a theory of change that says, okay, so we're going to equip you and we're going to sustain this to do what? So, in your connecting with all what sound like some really high level people,
Mhm.
what are their theories of change, of changing the whole of human behavior? What are we trying to change it towards?
Well, we're trying to change it towards um, a way of being with care. We're trying to change it towards what is, you know, life in our world look like if it's informed by care
Okay,
for others other than ourselves.
sure. The
And
web of life and all the rest of it. What
the
does it
web
look
of
in
life.
your world or in your thinking forward? What does that look like? What does it feel like? I want you, in the time we have left, which is about 3.5 minutes, to take us from swimming inside the death cult of predatory capitalism
Mm.
to emerging into something that is based on reciprocity and respect and relationship and
Yeah.
all of the R's that build community.
Mhm.
Are you seeing people who have a sense of the granularity? Because that's where I always see the big gap is we know where we are. We have a sense where we want to get to. That through topic route is really hard
Mhm. Mhm.
because capitalism, much as Trump seems to be trying to dismantle it in real time, if it crashes, it's going to be bad. How do
Yeah.
we make that transition in a way that keeps people alive? Is that a place that anyone that you meet is going to?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm seeing it expressed in all kinds of ways, primarily through individuals who are able to give voice to their care and concern, and desire to want to, change, whether it's in the fashion industry or the tech industry or in your community or what have you. I'm seeing this happening, unfolding primarily in our realms or our spheres of influence, right? So in a like that's the magic right there, and less about, as much as I personally would like to change the world, I'm very yeah, I'm in touch with my own like heroic complex. A lot of us have a hero complex. It's very natural because we're all little children inside. All of us are the very small child who deeply, deeply cares about nature and the world and the soil. And, I am still that little child that used to go to the creek and like collect whatever frogs and tadpoles. I am that child who would take dead bugs and bury them in the whatever. So all of us have that. That child is not gone. And I feel like that's what we're able to tap into is like our love, our care, and our desire to want to heal and make things better. But that has to be, it has to be connected with care, with compassion, with empathy, and with skillfulness, or what is called skillful mean, because a lot
Say
of
that last bit again. Skillful.
skillful means
Okay.
using skillful means to get things done, because otherwise, what we are doing instead is we're going around just sort of, you know, um, like sort of radiating our fear and worry and all that. And all we're doing is creating a lot of like, anxiety and worry and all of this. So again, it comes back to how do we process and work with our own feelings, our own experience, get the support we need, whether it's therapy or circle of friends or nature or whatever that is. But we need to find ways of continuously sort of metabolizing this work so that we can show up in the world as kind of, you know, present and clear as we possibly can.
Brilliant. Okay. We came quite close to answering the primary question of life, the universe, and everything. And it sounds like you're connecting with people who get this and who are listening to what you're saying. If you were to project us 5 years forward, and if they all listen to what you're saying, have you got a sense of how we could be at a cultural level, I guess is what I'm aiming for?
Well, a lot more people, I think, would see themselves as included and part of a movement of caring for the planet and for the future that doesn't rely on identities of being an activist or an environmentalist or a this or a that. But we would see a much more diverse and inclusive approach to attending to repairing, grieving, and cultivating new ways of being.
Right.
Yeah, I think
Right.
we would see, the so-called kind of environmental advocacy groups or nature advocacy become much more porous and diverse and less like, you know
An elite group of particular
yeah,
thinkers who all think the same way. Yes.
exactly. Yeah, I have this phrase, yell, tell, and sell. That's kind of been the modality for many years is the
Right.
yelling, telling, and selling. And
Right.
if you actually applied what we're talking about, it would look so much more like listening, partnering, collaborating, joining forces. And yes, debating and arguing. And it's not like I'm saying it's all some fantasy, like, kumbaya or whatever. But I'm talking about like cultures of respect and
Right.
reciprocity, you said.
Yeah.
But we've got to be able to confront some really dark stuff in our history and our past. Like we have to have the ability to do that, or we can't move forward, right?
Right.
It's just like the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa, which I know was far from perfect, very imperfect,
Sure.
but at least they made an attempt to create a process that allowed the culture to really like have that confrontation with
Yeah.
the past. And unless we do that as a human species, it's hard for me to see a way forward.
Okay. Back to your concept of containers, which is now landing with me much better. I had a coach who said we need to set up a container, and I spent
Right.
6 months in coaching, still not quite understanding what that was. So thank you. Now I do. And yes, setting up the space so that that feels not like an assault on somebody's core being.
Yes,
And
exactly. Yeah,
that also requires a lot of self-awareness, doesn't it?
yeah. And humility.
Yeah. And connecting to the web of life, because I would say once you're an integral part of the web of life, one's ego is less bound up with cultural identities that have to be defended. And that
Right.
sense of defending a space, I feel, it feels to me that what you're talking about are the necessary steps towards an evolution of being and an evolution of consciousness. And
Yeah.
that we have to evolve our consciousness if we're going to get to somewhere that is capable of the reciprocity and the respect and the connection to the web of life. And it just chinking open the door a little bit. It allows for there to be more change than we could possibly imagine. And I know that in my own life, that's the case with therapy, is that where I think we're going, where we actually get to, are radically different places because what I was capable of imagining changes and evolves.
Absolutely.
And so I'm thinking again, in the spaces that you're working in, with the kind of levels of people that you're working with, are you seeing that kind of awareness of potential shifting amongst the higher echelons?
Kind of. A little bit.
Did you to say yes, totally?
Okay.
Go back and yes, it is. Yes, everyone's becoming more aware.
Yes, the people and the leaders that I work with and who reach out to do work together absolutely see this and are doing whatever they can within their realms of influence and their spheres of influence to actually create a transformative culture in which people's capacities and innate, abilities are able to really come forward. Because again, that we have to just keep coming back to what are the conditions that really support and enable human ingenuity and creativity and care and love. We have to keep thinking about what are the conditions. And that's a very different question than how do you get someone to care or not. We
Sure.
need to tire that question. Stop asking how to get or make people care.
Okay, that's
Ask
back to the yelling and the
instead.
telling. And
Yeah,
instead,
it's like really it's what are the conditions? And when
Right.
you feel your way into that question of what are the conditions, I think folks who try it will start to see it will uncover and yield maybe some unexpected practices, interventions, experiments, and processes.
Okay, that's sounding good. And it's sounding probably, because what I'm thinking actually is it's the opposite of what's happening in the administration of your country at the moment. If they had sat down and thought, what are the circumstances that minimize all of those things?
Yeah.
That's what they're endeavoring to enact. But having that so clearly laid out, then I'm fairly certain there is a majority of people, definitely a plurality of people, and a tipping point of people who now are ready to ask the question of, okay, what are the circumstances? How can we set the stage?
I think so. Yeah.
We hope so. Alrighty. So I would definitely like to talk to you again when your book is about to come out.
Right.
Between now, just as we're closing, is there anything else that you wanted to say that we haven't got to, that you feel would be useful for people?
Only to, well, one is to acknowledge that these kinds of conversations that we're having are themselves creating sort of containers for processing, sense making. So this is very generative and really important to be having these conversations. So I want to acknowledge you in having this podcast and really opening up these, these interactions with people is itself an expression of what we're talking about. Yeah, and I want to encourage other people to consider, well, what can we do in our, realms, whatever that is, to invite reflection and inquiry and humility. And the final thing I would just say is that this is a time of humility. There's a quote I always introduce in my work by my colleague and friend, Amy Edmondson, where she says, it's hard to learn if you already know. And, I love invoking that because it is uncomfortable to be in that place of not knowing. And at the same time, what I also want to say, like, really, like, affirm that there's a lot we do know. So we know quite a bit about humans and about human nature and about, like, we don't need to do a lot more research on, like, what motivates people to wanna make big change. We already know. But what we don't know and where the humility has a place and how we apply that, how do we innovate? How do we see ourselves as innovators when it comes to change making?
Right. And how do we bring it into our culture such that these kinds of conversations become the norm instead of the exception?
Right,
Because if
exactly.
this was happening, I don't know, in the soap operas on television, in the Marvel movies, in David Attenborough,
Mhm,
this level of conversation,
mhm.
then it becomes accessible to everybody, and then it becomes the way people is thinking.
Yeah,
And our politics, for instance, our whole governance system, our economy, our business, everything would change because people's baselines would be different.
absolutely. So let's do it. Let's
Yeah,
scale it.
absolutely. Yes. Yay. All right. That is a good place to end. So, Renée Lertzman, thank you so much for coming on to the Accidental Goals podcast. I'm really looking forward to another conversation with you in
Yeah,
probably
me
about a
too.
year's time.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.